"You're fighting the wrong system," she whispered. And the plane, groaning through the storm, listened. At 32,000 feet, the world is reduced to vibration and light. The plane hummed under Abby Carter's seat, a low, familiar rumble like a dragon breathing. Seat 14C, aisle. Not by choice. She always preferred the window, but the airline rep had smiled too quickly and said, "You'll be fine right here, sweetheart." She had nodded. That's what she always did. It was her first time flying alone. 10 years old and quiet as the sky before thunder, Abby sat with her hands folded over the leather strap of a worn pilot's watch. It was too big for her wrist. Every few seconds, she adjusted it, not for comfort, but to keep it from slipping over the bump of her hand. Her thumb traced the ridge of the crown, that little gear that could change the world if you knew what to do with it. The captain's voice crackled overhead. "Folks, we're expecting a bit of turbulence. Nothing to worry about. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Abby already had hers fastened. She always did. She had double-checked it when they taxied out of Columbus and again when they reached cruising altitude. She glanced across the row, a teenage boy, asleep with his mouth open, headphones in. Across the aisle, a woman typing furiously on her laptop. No one noticed the lights dimming for a moment longer than usual. No one noticed the faint click beneath the floor, but Abby did. She sat up straighter. There it was again. That strange shift in the hum. Not pitch, not vibration, pressure. Her fingers found the edge of the armrest. She closed her eyes, listened. Not to the sound, but to the space around it. Her grandfather had taught her that. "The plane speaks, Abby," he used to say. "Most people just don't know how to listen." A burst of light, white and jagged, lit up the cabin windows. Thunder cracked a second later. The woman with the laptop glanced up, uneasy. The teen beside Abby stirred, grunted, and pulled his hoodie tighter over his head. Then it came, the wrong sound. A groan, low and metallic, like something twisting against itself. The plane dipped, just slightly, but enough to jostle a few drinks. A baby cried in the back. Then the cabin lights flickered, and for the first time, Abby felt it. The system had shifted. She didn't panic. Instead, she reached into her small blue backpack and pulled out a notebook. It was already half filled with flight paths, diagrams, scribbled notes from conversations with her grandfather. She flipped to the page with the hydraulic systems. Her pencil scratched across the margin. Primary circuit. Overloaded? Backup line still responsive. Why is the trim control offset? The plane trembled again, this time harder. Gasps echoed. A suitcase fell from an overhead bin. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed again, not that anyone had unbuckled. A flight attendant walked briskly down the aisle. Abby looked up. Her voice was calm, measured when she spoke. "Ma'am? Excuse me?" The flight attendant paused. She was young, maybe mid-20s, blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. "Yes, honey?" "I think the plane's hydraulic system is failing," Abby said. The woman blinked. Abby didn't flinch. "The primary circuit's still connected, but the load is wrong. You need to tell the cockpit." There was a long pause. The attendant crouched. "Are you feeling scared, sweetie?" Abby shook her head. "No. I'm feeling the trim compensation is unbalanced. I think the left stabilizer didn't reset after the last bank." The attendant looked back toward the galley. Another jolt rattled the aircraft. "Can you write that down?" she asked. Abby handed her the notebook, already open to the diagram she'd just drawn. Within seconds, The attendant disappeared to the front. Abby closed her eyes again. She whispered to herself, "You're fighting the wrong system." She wasn't even sure if she meant the pilots or the aircraft itself. 10 minutes passed before anything changed. Then, a different voice over the intercom, sharper, curious. "Would the young lady in seat 14C please come to the front of the cabin?" People turned. Whispers spread down the rows. Abby stood slowly. She clutched the watch on her wrist, tightened the strap, and walked forward. Tiny footsteps down an aisle, suddenly silent. At the front, the flight attendant waited, eyes wide, lips tight. She held the door open. Abby stepped into the cockpit. It smelled like heat and electricity. Two pilots turned toward her, both in their 40s, one balding, the other with a salt and pepper beard. Captain Doyle, his name tag read. "You're Abby Carter?" he asked, voice somewhere between disbelief and concern. "Yes, sir." The co-pilot held the notebook. "This is yours?" "Yes." Doyle gestured to the seat behind them. "Come, show me." Abby slid into the observer's chair. Screens blinked in front of her. The plane lurched again, but her hands stayed steady. "Okay," the captain said, humoring her. "What are we looking at?" She pointed. "Trim compensator. The pitch control is overcorrecting. You're trying to fix something that isn't the actual issue." Doyle raised an eyebrow. "And what is?" "The primary hydraulic loop is still operational," Abby said. "But the pressure valve is stuck. You're getting resistance, so you're overcompensating. You need to switch to the auxiliary system before the valve fails completely." Silence. The co-pilot stared at her. Captain Doyle's fingers hovered over the controls. "If we're wrong..." "You're not," Abby said. "The plane's groaning because it's fighting itself." He looked at her for a long moment, then back at the screen. "Auxiliary circuit," he said. The co-pilot nodded. A switch flipped. The vibration changed, smoother, calmer, like the aircraft took a deep breath and finally stopped bracing against itself. 20 minutes later, they landed in Baltimore. It was not a planned stop. The emergency vehicles were waiting. No one panicked, no alarms, just a smooth, controlled descent. Inside the cabin, people clapped. No one knew who they were clapping for, not yet. Abby sat back in seat 14C. She didn't say a word. She simply looked at the watch on her wrist. It was still ticking, exactly on time. There are things you can only learn in silence. Abby Carter knew that better than most kids her age. Long before the storm, before the cockpit, before the world had ever heard her name, there was only a quiet living room in Columbus, Ohio, and the sound of her grandfather winding a watch. Tick, tick, tick. She was 5 years old the first time she asked about it. "What makes it go, Grandpa?" she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. He'd smiled and placed the old pilot's watch into her open palm. It was heavy, with a brown leather strap and a face scratched from decades of wear. "What makes it go," he said, "is tension. A spring wound tight, just waiting to release. You keep it wound right, and it tells the truth of every second." She hadn't understood then, not really. But she remembered the way he said it, like time itself was something sacred. His name was Walter Greaves. Once upon a time, he flew Boeing 737s across the continental U.S. with the kind of calm that only came from near misses and nights spent listening to the wind from 35,000 feet. He wasn't a famous pilot, never gave lectures or wrote memoirs, but he was the kind of man mechanics trusted more than manuals. "Planes talk to you," he used to say, "but not in words. You've got to learn their language." Most people thought he was being poetic. Abby didn't. She listened. From the time she could sit still without being told, she sat beside him with a notebook and asked questions. Not childish ones, real ones. What does it mean when the flaps shudder on landing? Why do some engines whine louder when the wheels retract? How come some turbulence sounds sharp and some just feels like a roll in your stomach? He never laughed at her. Never once said she was too young. Instead, he'd nod slowly and lean back in his recliner, hands folded, eyes distant. Sharp turbulence usually means crosswinds. Your stomach rolls when it's updrafts or thermal pockets. Planes hate sharp angles. They like to glide, even in chaos. She'd write it down word for word. She had over a dozen notebooks by the time she turned 8, each filled with diagrams, pilot lingo, cockpit schematics, and notes scribbled in the careful handwriting of a girl who treated every page like a promise. But there was one thing her grandfather never spoke about directly: the watch. He wore it every day, even after he stopped flying. It wasn't just a relic. It was something else. Something that meant more. She asked him about it again when she was 9. It was spring, and the lilacs were blooming outside the kitchen window. He was making coffee the old-fashioned way. No machine, just a kettle, a filter, and a slow hand. "It's a long story," he said, setting the mug down in front of her. "I've got time," she replied. He laughed. Not at her, with her. So he told her. Years ago, before she was born, before her father was even in high school, Walter had filed a formal suggestion to the FAA. It was simple: a redesign of the hydraulic pressure monitoring system for a certain model of mid-range aircraft. He'd noticed a pattern in stress points, subtle inconsistencies that didn't appear on digital diagnostics but showed up in the behavior of the plane itself. He'd brought it up during inspections, mentioned it during maintenance reports. No one listened. Until one day, he wrote a 12-page technical recommendation and mailed it to the FAA directly, with data collected from his own flights, hand-recorded readings, and sketches of how the backup system could be improved. He never got a reply. 3 months later, he was asked to take early retirement. No one said it outright, but he knew. "You don't rattle the cage unless you're ready to lose the seat," he told Abby. The watch had been a gift from an old mechanic the day he flew his last route. "You were the only one who actually listened to the machine," the man said. "You deserve to keep time better than they do." Abby wore it every day after that story. Not because it was valuable, but because it was real, and because she felt the weight of it, like she was carrying the questions no one else had answered. In the months leading up to the flight from Columbus to Boston, Abby had started doing something different. She began recording the sounds of each aircraft she flew on. With her phone on airplane mode and a small external mic hidden in her hoodie, she captured the whine of the turbines, the groans of retraction gears, and the ambient frequencies of cruise-level flight. Then she'd sit at home, plug in her headphones, and close her eyes. Not to relax, to analyze. She wasn't playing pilot. She was decoding a language most grown-ups had forgotten how to hear. And the more she listened, the more she noticed patterns. Certain aircraft, especially older Airbus models, had what she called asymmetric sighs, brief moments of pressure shift when the hydraulics were pushed harder than they needed to be. Her grandfather had once called them ghost hitches. She had a chart of them now, notes in red pen, dates, flight numbers, routes. She didn't know what it all meant yet, but she could feel something under the data. A wrongness that repeated itself like a stutter in the sky. On the morning of the flight to Boston, Abby's mother had knelt beside her in the airport terminal, brushing blonde wisps from her face. "You've got your books?" "Yes." "Snacks?" "Yes, Mom." "And if you feel uncomfortable, I'll press the call button. I remember. Her mom paused. You don't have to be brave all the time, you know. Abby looked at her. I'm not trying to be brave. I'm just trying to hear things before other people do. Her mother didn't understand. Not really. But she smiled anyway and kissed her on the head. It wasn't until boarding that Abby realized she'd left her lucky pencil in the car. She didn't panic. She just reached for the watch and turned the crown once, slowly, until the tick aligned perfectly with the second hand. Then she took her seat. 414C. When the plane landed in Baltimore after the emergency descent, she didn't say much to the officials who approached. She didn't argue when one man in a gray jacket tried to gently usher her back to her seat. She only handed them her notebook. Inside it were 4 pages of observations, 2 diagrams, and a single sentence circled 3 times. The plane is telling you the truth. You just have to believe it. No one knew what to do with that. So they let her go. That night, Abby sat in her father's Boston apartment, curled in a blanket on the couch. News alerts buzzed from the TV. Phrases like unexplained mid-flight malfunction and textbook emergency landing scrolled across the bottom of the screen. No one mentioned a 10-year-old girl. But Abby didn't care. She opened her notebook, turned to a fresh page, and wrote at the top, Ghost Hitch number 14, Baltimore descent. She clicked her pen and began to write. The landing itself was so smooth it made no sense. Baltimore was never supposed to be part of the flight plan. The passengers on Flight 1862 were scheduled to land in Boston by 3:55 p.m., just in time for the late spring drizzle that rolled in off the Atlantic. But at 3:27 p.m., the wheels touched down on runway 10 at BWI with a softness that betrayed the urgency that had filled the air only minutes earlier. Inside the cabin, no one cheered. No one clapped. It was quiet, eerily so, as if the passengers, still strapped into their seats, couldn't quite process what had happened. Something had gone wrong. Something serious. They'd all felt the drop, the rattle, the change in engine tone. But there'd been no announcements, no screaming, no masks falling from the ceiling. Only a strange tension that hung over everything, like the moment just before thunder. And then, the plane landed. Just like that. An elderly man near the back wiped his glasses. A toddler stirred from sleep. A flight attendant walked down the aisle, smiling faintly, hands trembling just enough to be noticed by those who were paying close attention. Abby Carter was back in seat 14C, notebook closed, watch ticking. Her heart was steady. She wasn't surprised the landing was smooth. She had told them what to do, and for once, they'd listened. But she also knew what would come next, what always came next. The forgetting. On the tarmac, emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft like cautious animals circling a wounded one, sirens muted, engines humming. Airport personnel stood at a distance, clipboards in hand, waiting for permission to move closer. In the cockpit, Captain Doyle removed his headset slowly, his hand resting for a long moment on the switch that had activated the auxiliary hydraulics. The silence in his head now was almost louder than the alarms had been. He turned to his co-pilot. "Log everything," he said. "What about the girl?" Doyle didn't answer. He just looked down at the worn notebook still sitting open on the control panel. A child's handwriting, technical but raw, circled diagrams, arrows pointing to things only experienced pilots should have recognized. "She saved us," the co-pilot whispered. Doyle exhaled. "No," he said. "She saved herself. We just followed instructions." Outside the terminal, the passengers were ushered off the plane in slow, controlled rows. No one panicked. Everyone walked calmly. Some looked back at the aircraft as if expecting to see smoke trailing from it, some kind of visible scar. But it sat peacefully, a silver giant resting after a long exhale. Abby exited in the third group. No one looked at her. No one noticed the girl with the two large pilot's watch and the navy blue backpack swinging slightly as she walked. A TSA officer asked if she was unaccompanied. She nodded. They gave her a juice box and a sticker. "Great job being brave," the woman said cheerfully, kneeling beside her. Abby simply nodded. Brave wasn't the word she would have used. She hadn't felt brave in the cockpit, just certain. Like everything her grandfather had taught her had finally lined up at the exact second the plane started groaning. She sat in the corner of the waiting area, sipping juice, watching the adults scramble. Airport officials, pilots from other flights, investigators in dark suits with narrow eyes. A man in a gray tie flipped through a file marked Preliminary Flight Incident FL-1862. Another woman whispered into a phone. No one looked at her. Perfect. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her notebook. On a clean page, she drew the outline of a plane's hydraulic system and, next to it, a sentence. Redundancy means nothing if no one listens when it matters. She underlined it twice. 3 hours later, the story hit the wires. Emergency landing in Baltimore. All 213 passengers. Safe unidentified system failure, averted by crew action. Captain cites instinct in decision to override systems. The word instinct appeared over and over again. Not data, not analysis, not child, not girl, not 10. Instinct. Captain Doyle didn't give a statement. The airline released a carefully worded message about the professionalism of its crew and its commitment to safety. Nothing about the girl in 14C. Nothing about the note. Nothing about the switch that was flipped, the one that hadn't been on any checklist. Abby watched the news segment on her father's laptop, curled up on his couch in Boston. Her dad was pacing behind her, phone buzzing with texts from co-workers and worried family. "Do they know it was you?" he asked finally, voice low. "No," Abby said. "And they won't." Her father sat beside her. He worked in logistics, not aviation. He didn't always understand her diagrams or her vocabulary. But he knew when she meant something deeply. "Why not?" "Because it wouldn't change anything," Abby said. "They'd just say it was luck, or pretend it didn't happen, like they did with Grandpa." He went quiet. She closed the laptop, looked down at the watch. Tick, tick, tick. But the world doesn't keep secrets for long. Especially not in 2025. 2 days after the emergency landing, a video appeared on TikTok. It was grainy, shaky, obviously filmed on a phone. It showed a young girl standing at the front of the aircraft cabin just outside the cockpit door. She was holding a notebook. A flight attendant stood beside her, one hand protectively on the girl's shoulder. The footage was only a few seconds long, barely enough to identify her face. But it was enough. The caption read, "This little girl got called into the cockpit right before we landed. Anyone know what happened on Flight 1862? It spread like wildfire. Within 6 hours, the video had over 500,000 views. Within 12, someone commented, "Her name's Abby. My cousin works at the airport. Says she told the pilot something technical, like a real prodigy or something." By the end of the day, her face was on news sites. Some called her a genius. Others called it fake. One aviation forum wrote, "Let's be real. There's no way a 10-year-old would know how to assess a hydraulic switch failure mid-flight. It's just another internet myth." Another user replied with a freeze frame of her notebook, leaked from the cockpit photo. "Then, explain this." Abby watched it all happen from her father's kitchen table. He'd closed the curtains. "Do you want me to call someone?" he asked. "The airline, maybe." "A lawyer?" She shook her head. "What do you want, then?" "I want to write it down before they erase it." And she did. Page after page. Not just the systems and the diagrams, but what it felt like. The tremble in the fuselage, the expression on Captain Doyle's face, the weight of silence in the cockpit. The moment when everything made sense. And still, she had to convince someone twice her age to believe her. At the bottom of the final page, she wrote a sentence that would stay with her for years. "I knew what to do, but I still had to earn the right to be heard." The official report was 56 pages long. It had diagrams, timestamps, technical readouts from Flight 1962's cockpit recorders, and a full analysis of the hydraulic anomaly that had nearly brought down the aircraft. The phrase, "pilot judgment under uncertainty," was used 3 times. The word "heroic" was used once, referring to Captain Doyle. But nowhere in those 56 pages was the name Abby Carter. Not once. There was no mention of the 10-year-old girl who had stood in the aisle with a notebook. No reference to the child's hand-drawn diagram left on the cockpit console, no acknowledgement of the auxiliary switch suggestion, except in vague language about manual override initiated under the captain's discretion. It was a report written by lawyers. Cautious, calculated, clean. The airline's legal department had already made the decision days before the report was released. Do not officially confirm a child entered the cockpit. Do not acknowledge her role. Do not expose the company to risk. If it gets out that a minor gave technical instructions mid-flight, one executive had said behind closed doors, we're not talking about hero stories. We're talking lawsuits, FAA violations, pilot suspensions, public panic. And so, the report told the story they were comfortable telling, a story about routine emergency protocols and a veteran pilot who relied on instinct. It would have worked too, if it weren't for the video. The video that had quietly gone viral, the one showing Abby standing outside the cockpit door, had made its way to more than just curious passengers. A retired pilot named Jeanette Hall saw it first. She'd flown for 32 years, including the final 5 as an FAA trainer, before retiring to teach at a small aviation college in Colorado. She wasn't active on TikTok, but her niece was, and she sent her the clip with the caption, "Did you see this? People say the kid solved a hydraulic issue mid-air." Jeanette watched it on loop. The girl's posture, the notebook in her hand, the quiet steadiness in her face. Then Jeanette remembered the headline, "Captain Cites Instinct." She clicked on the incident report, and her blood pressure spiked. "Instinct," she muttered. "My ass." She downloaded the video, took screenshots, enhanced the contrast. And then she found the frame that showed a half-visible page from Abby's notebook. The technical drawing. It was rough, slanted. A child's hand, sure, but unmistakable in what it depicted. A classic hydraulic bypass scheme used in Airbus models, annotated with arrows and a single line of instruction. Divert load before the valve fails. Jeanette Hall stared at it for nearly an hour. Then she made a phone call. Back in Boston, Abby sat at her father's kitchen table, tracing circles in the condensation on her glass of milk. The world had gone quiet again. At least, almost. Every day, a new piece of the truth leaked. An anonymous employee from the airline left a comment on a Reddit thread suggesting someone had advised the cockpit. A blurry photo of Abby's notebook page was posted on an aviation forum, then taken down within hours. One user reposted it with the caption, "She's 10, and she was right." but none of it had a source, and so none of it stuck. That changed one morning when Abby's father opened the door to find a woman in a navy jacket, silver hair tied in a low knot, holding a folder. "Mr. Carter?" she asked. "Yes." "My name is Jeanette Hall. I'm a retired FAA trainer. I came to talk to your daughter." Abby looked up from the living room. She didn't move. Her father hesitated. "She's not giving interviews." "I'm not the press," Jeanette said. "I used to teach pilots how to handle the exact failure your daughter predicted. And I've never seen anyone respond the way she did. I thought maybe I could listen." That last sentence cracked the silence open like a window. Abby stood. Her voice was quiet. "You brought the report with you, didn't you?" Jeanette nodded. She handed Abby the folder. "It's the public version, the one without you in it." Abby opened it, skimmed it, stopped at page 37. There it was, the moment of the switch to the auxiliary hydraulic system, described clinically like a shrug. "Activated during turbulence," the sentence read. "Decision attributed to captain's professional judgment." Abby stared at the words for a long time. Then, "They're afraid of the truth." Jeanette sat down across from her. "Yes, they are. My grandfather warned about this system 7 years ago," Abby said. "He sent in a report. They never replied. Then they fired him." Jeanette's eyebrows lifted. "Walter Greaves?" Abby nodded. Jeanette closed her eyes. "I knew his name sounded familiar. I read that report. He was right. He was just early." Abby reached into her backpack and pulled out a stack of folded notebook pages. She laid them flat on the table, a mosaic of mechanical sketches, notes, and error patterns. Jeanette studied them in silence. Finally, she said, "Would you let me tell this story properly?" Abby didn't speak right away. Then she asked, "Will they believe you?" Jeanette smiled. "No, not at first, but they'll believe you." The next day, an article appeared in the Boston Chronicle. The girl in seat 14C, and the system that tried to forget her. It was long, detailed, and different from everything that had come before. It didn't rely on hearsay. It quoted diagrams. It interviewed engineers. It told the story of a child whose instincts were built not on magic but memory. The memory of her grandfather's teachings and the feel of engines in her bones. The article didn't name the airline, but it didn't have to. By the end of the week, the article had been shared over 1 million times. The comments were a battlefield. "No way this is real. Sounds like a Netflix script. I used to fly that model. Those valves do stick under high-altitude compounding. If she's right, how come no one in the cockpit noticed it first?" Because sometimes truth doesn't come with credentials. Captain Doyle read the article in a hotel room. He folded it, set it beside the window. Then he picked up his phone and typed a message he'd debated for days. "To whom it may concern, I request an addendum to the official report. The switch was flipped not by instinct, but based on technical advice provided by passenger Abby Carter, age 10, who correctly identified the failure risk and proposed a safe alternative." He hit send. Then he exhaled. That night, Abby sat in her room in Boston, cross-legged in front of a corkboard covered in strings and sketches. She added a new headline to the top: "What They Tried to Erase." Underneath it, she pinned a sticky note with her grandfather's handwriting. "Listen with everything you have, even if they don't." She looked at the empty space beside it and smiled. By the time Monday came, Abby Carter's name was no longer just a whisper on aviation forums or buried in a local news article. It was trending on Twitter, headlining on morning TV shows, and debated across coffee shops, classrooms, and conference calls. But not everyone was celebrating. "She's just a kid." The phrase repeated itself like a drumbeat. On talk shows, they said it with a smile, as if it explained everything. On Reddit, it was used as both compliment and dismissal. In boardrooms, it was muttered behind closed doors, meant to excuse the omission of her name from every official report. And at Abby's school, it was a problem. Abby returned to class a week after the article was published. The hallways fell quiet when she walked through them. Some kids stared, others whispered. A few tried to approach her during lunch with forced grins and questions like, "Are you really, like, a pilot or something?" She didn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't explain what it felt like to be in a cockpit while the plane groaned and no one else seemed to hear it. She was moved to the back row in science class, not as punishment, but to give her space. Even the teacher avoided her eyes. By Friday, Abby stopped raising her hand. At home, things weren't easier. Her father's phone buzzed constantly. Interview requests, emails from media outlets, 2 talent agencies, one major publisher offering a ghost-written memoir with a 7-figure advance. He declined them all, but not before Abby heard the words, "movie rights." "I don't want a movie," she said. "I know, sweetheart," her dad replied. "I don't want to be famous. I want to be understood." He didn't know what to say to that, so he hugged her. That night, Abby erased the whiteboard in her room and rewrote a single line across the top. "Fame is what they give you when they can't explain what you did." But someone else was trying to explain. Across the country, in a modest beige building outside Seattle, a nonprofit organization called Altitude Academy was holding an emergency board meeting. The Altitude Academy was small, but its mission was bold. Early aviation exposure for gifted students under the age of 16. It wasn't a flight school, not officially, more of a lab/simulator/sandbox where mathematical intuition met mechanical systems. Its director, a former aerospace engineer named Tessa Lin, had founded it after leaving Boeing, frustrated with the industry's rigid gatekeeping. Tessa had read the Boston Chronicle article 3 times. She'd also watched the cockpit video, the one showing Abby with her notebook. Someone had sent it to her anonymously. And Tessa had cried. Not because Abby was extraordinary, but because she saw something heartbreakingly normal in her. A child trying to share what she knew in a world that didn't want to hear it. So she wrote an email. Subject, for Abby Carter. An invitation. Dear Abby, I don't know if you want more attention, but I know you deserve more support. We'd like to invite you to a private session at Altitude Academy. No cameras, no interviews. Just a place to explore what you already understand, and maybe learn more. You won't be the only one like you here. Tessa Lin, Director, Altitude Academy. When the email arrived, Abby stared at it for a full hour before saying anything. Then she looked at her father. "Can we go?" He didn't hesitate. Absolutely. The facility was nothing like she expected. Not polished, not sleek, just focused. The entrance was lined with chalkboards filled with equations. In the center of the main room sat a deconstructed cockpit surrounded by layered displays. No one wore suits. Some didn't even wear shoes. A teenager with purple hair adjusted the angle of a wind tunnel blade while a younger boy explained Reynolds numbers with a stutter and a grin. No one looked at Abby like she didn't belong. Tessa Lin greeted her with a nod. Not a smile, but something better. Recognition. "You want to see something cool?" Tessa asked. Abby nodded. They walked to a side room. Inside was a flight simulator. Not the type made for public display or flashy games, but a serious training-grade model. The seat was worn, the screen was matte, the controls were real. Seattle to Salt Lake, Tessa said, with a simulated trim malfunction at 30 minutes in. You game? Abby stepped in, no hesitation. 2 minutes later, the simulator was humming. 5 minutes in, she called the malfunction before it fully manifested. At 11 minutes, she had rerouted the control logic and stabilized the virtual aircraft, all without tripping the autopilot override. Tessa watched from behind, arms folded. When Abby emerged, hair slightly damp with focus, Tessa said simply, "That wasn't luck." "I know." "It wasn't instinct either." Abby met her gaze. "It was memory." That night, Abby and her father stayed at a small inn near the bay. She sat outside with a blanket around her shoulders, sketching new diagrams in the glow of the porch light. Her watch ticked quietly under her wrist. From inside, the news played softly. A panel of guests debated whether children like Abby should ever be allowed near a cockpit, even in emergencies. "She's just a kid," one expert said. "A bright one, sure, but the rules exist for a reason." Another nodded. "We can't turn aviation into a science fair project." And yet, the public was shifting. Because now, on every screen, you could see what they were trying to erase. A girl who hadn't asked for attention, only accuracy. A girl who didn't call herself a hero. A girl who knew the sound a plane made when it cried for help. The next morning, Abby received a letter. It was handwritten. "Dear Abby, I've been flying commercial jets for 18 years. I've taught dozens of new pilots. None of them ever described system failure the way you did. You don't just hear the plane. You understand it. Please don't let the noise of this world drown out the clarity of your gift. If you're ever near Chicago, I'd be honored to let you co-pilot the sim. Captain Elijah Doyle." Abby folded the letter and placed it beside her grandfather's notebook. Then she added a sticky note under the whiteboard on her wall. "She's just a kid." And that's what made her unstoppable. Some truths don't fade with time. They linger, hidden in circuit boards, in the hiss of hydraulic lines, in the memory of those who once tried to speak them aloud. Abby Carter was only 10, but she already knew what it felt like to carry a truth no one wanted. The week after her return from Altitude Academy, she received a call she didn't expect, not from the media, not from a sponsor, but from a man who used to sit at her grandfather's kitchen table 20 years ago, drinking weak coffee and cursing corporate silence. His name was Frank Bellamy. He had worked with her grandfather at Horizon Air for nearly 2 decades. Frank had been the senior mechanical analyst. Now, he was a retired man with trembling hands and an old man's guilt. "Your granddad used to say the system doesn't just ignore problems," Frank said on the phone. "It buries them." Abby didn't interrupt. "He saw it," Frank continued. "That fault you spotted on 1862? Your grandfather submitted a report about a similar malfunction in 2018, not a theory. Real data." "I know," Abby said quietly. "He showed me the original draft. It was never acknowledged." Frank exhaled. "I remember that week. I remember how tired he looked when they passed him over. How they told him to let engineering handle the numbers. He came into my office the next day and said, 'They'll listen one day. Maybe not to me, but to someone with smaller hands and fewer gray hairs.'" Abby closed her eyes. She could see her grandfather at the window, cleaning his glasses with a napkin, pretending not to be bitter. "He was right," she whispered. There was a pause on the other end. "I have something for you," Frank said. "Something they never meant to leave behind." The next morning, a padded envelope arrived. Inside was a faded manila folder. The original cover sheet read, "Hydraulic feedback irregularity, multi-axis failure window." Below it, "Submitted by Walter Greaves." The folder contained printed schematics, annotated graphs, and 2 hand-drawn failure models. The last page was a formal letter of rejection from the engineering board. While your observations are technically intriguing, our data does not support the likelihood of this scenario under standard flight conditions. No further action required at this time. But Abby didn't just read the pages. She recognized them. Because nearly every anomaly her grandfather listed had also appeared in her own notebook. And in one terrifying moment, she realized, the failure on Flight 1862 wasn't random. It was predicted and ignored. 3 days later, a second revelation came, from a place Abby didn't expect, her father's bookshelf. While searching for a paperclip, Abby found an old black USB stick wedged behind a photo album. It had a strip of masking tape across it labeled only WG. She plugged it into her laptop. Inside was a folder titled Not Yet. Inside that folder was a scanned, unfinished manuscript. Listening to the Machine. Notes from a Silenced Pilot. The last modified date was 5 years ago. Her grandfather had tried to write a book. Each page was raw and handwritten. Some were rants, others were stories. But scattered between the frustration and quiet sorrow were exact details, page after page, of a hydraulic inconsistency he'd mapped over 22 flights. He even gave it a name. Ghost hitch, a slow-burn instability triggered by thermal contraction at high altitudes, particularly during weather shifts, misread by digital diagnostics, but audible in resonance frequencies. Abby gasped. That's what she had felt. That's what she had heard. She thought it was her own discovery, but it was his legacy, passed down, not in lectures, but in listening. Her hands trembling, she printed the manuscript and compiled it with the folder Frank had sent. Then she made a decision. She would not go back to silence. That weekend, Abby's father drove her to MIT. Not for an interview, but for a simulation test hosted by a team of flight safety researchers who had read the Boston Chronicle article, and who did believe her. The lead investigator, Dr. Simone Alvarez, was skeptical by nature. She had taught aerospace dynamics for 17 years, ran a lab focused on human-machine interaction, and had never let a student, much less a child, enter her test chamber without triple verification. But when Abby walked in holding the folder labeled WG and the worn, leather-strapped watch, she paused. Abby handed her the papers. Dr. Alvarez spent 3 hours reviewing them before she spoke again. "We've seen this before," she murmured, "but not like this, not this complete." "Then why hasn't it been fixed?" Abby asked. Dr. Alvarez looked away. "Because it would require an admission that the current diagnostic system is incomplete. That pilots and machines are missing something." Abby nodded slowly. "You're saying it would cost them more to admit it than to prevent it." Dr. Alvarez didn't reply. She just tapped the simulator console. "You ready to show me how you'd fix it?" Inside the simulator, Abby didn't hesitate. She mapped the same failure window from Flight 1862, except this time, she let it progress 5 seconds longer before intervention. She wanted to test the result of not being listened to. The system spiraled into a hard stall. In real life, the aircraft would have broken altitude and possibly suffered structural damage before the backup kicked in. Then she ran it again, this time following her grandfather's ghost hitch protocol. Smooth correction, balanced pressure, no loss of altitude. Twice more, she simulated alternate failures. One involving sensor drift, one with weather compounding shear. In every instance, Abby not only anticipated the warning signs before the computer, she wrote down the auditory shift by memory. "She doesn't think like a pilot," one engineer whispered to another. She thinks like the plane. Dr. Alvarez called a closed-door meeting that evening. Her recommendation was swift. We submit the Greaves-Carter model for formal peer review, she said, and we pressure the FAA to reinvestigate the oversight. This isn't a coincidence, it's a pattern. One board member hesitated. But we'd be using data collected unofficially, by a child. Dr. Alvarez turned to him, voice firm. You think the plane cared who was listening? That night, Abby stood in front of the mirror in her hotel room. She didn't see a hero. She saw a girl with tired eyes, a brain that never slowed down, and a truth no one had expected her to carry. And yet, here she was. She pulled out the old watch and set it beside the printed manuscript. Then she picked up a pen. At the top of a fresh notebook page, she wrote, They buried the man who heard it first, but they forgot he taught someone how to listen louder. It began with a chair, a glass of water, and a quiet girl in a navy blue dress. The lights in the studio were brighter than anything Abby Carter had ever faced, brighter than cockpit gauges, simulator screens, or even the flashes of turbulence across a night sky. But what unnerved her most wasn't the lights. It was the silence. The kind that comes before millions of people decide what kind of story they want you to be. The invitation came from Mara Sloan, a veteran journalist known for refusing sensationalism. Her segment, Voices That Matter, had featured whistleblowers, unsung scientists, and survivors who refused to stay quiet. Mara had read the Boston Chronicle article twice. Then she read the MIT research notes that named the Greaves-Carter protocol. Then she watched the video of Abby's simulator tests, the one where she caught a trim failure 3 seconds before the system did. And finally, she made the call herself. Abby had almost said no. She didn't want more lights, more eyes. But something in Mara's voice felt different. It wasn't curiosity, it was reverence. So Abby agreed. The interview wasn't live. It was pre-recorded, a choice Mara insisted on. I don't want your first experience with the national stage to be something someone else controls, she told Abby. You'll speak. I'll listen. That's it. They met in a small studio in New York. No audience, just a carpeted room, 2 chairs, and a long wooden table. Abby brought her notebook and the old pilot's watch. She didn't dress like a genius or a hero. She wore sneakers and her favorite denim jacket with the sleeves rolled up. Mara began softly. Can you tell me what you felt when you walked into the cockpit that day? Abby blinked once. I felt like someone had opened a door, and I had 3 seconds to walk through it before it slammed shut. Mara paused. Were you afraid? No, Abby said. Then after a beat, not of being wrong. I was afraid they'd assume I was. Mara leaned forward, voice low. And when they listened? Abby smiled, the first real smile of the interview. I felt like the sky exhaled. They spoke for 40 minutes. No edits, no redirections. Mara asked about Abby's grandfather, about the flight, the diagrams, the simulator tests, and most of all, about what it felt like to know something the world kept saying she shouldn't. Abby didn't cry. She didn't break. But near the end, when Mara asked what she would say to the people who still insisted it was luck, Abby said only this. A lot of people think pilots save planes, but sometimes a plane tries to save itself. I just heard it first. The interview aired Sunday night. It was supposed to be a quiet segment, tucked between political debate and a piece about climate tech. But by morning, it had already been shared 2.3 million times. Clips went viral on every platform. Her quote, I just heard it first, was printed on T-shirts, in memes, on coffee mugs. But more importantly, something else happened. people stopped calling her lucky. By Wednesday, Captain Elijah Doyle publicly confirmed Abby's role in Flight 1862's emergency landing. In a formal statement posted on his Pilot Association's website, he wrote, "I did not act alone. I followed a child's instructions, and in doing so, I saved a plane full of people. That is not shameful. That is proof that truth has no age." The FAA, which had up until that point remained silent, issued a follow-up statement that sounded more like surrender than support. "We are reviewing new evidence submitted by MIT researchers regarding early detection protocols and the Greaves-Carter model. In light of recent events, procedural amendments may be proposed." Suddenly, Abby's name wasn't just being spoken. It was being studied. But not everyone welcomed it. A well-known airline executive went on a radio program and scoffed, "It's irresponsible to turn a child into a systems analyst. She's 10. There's no model for this, no precedent." He was right. There wasn't. Until now. The next day, Abby received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a handwritten note. "When I was 10, I built a paper model of a P-51 Mustang and told my uncle I'd fly one someday." He laughed. 50 years later, I retired from the Air Force as a test pilot. I wish someone had believed me sooner." Colonel R. Mackenzie, retired. P.S. I believe you. There were dozens more like it. Letters from engineers, pilots, mothers of daughters who sat up late replaying the interview. One came from a 13-year-old boy with autism who wrote in block letters, "I feel engines too. Thank you for making that okay." MIT invited Abby back, this time not to simulate, but to speak. She stood at the front of a packed lecture hall. At first, she was nervous. Then she saw the professors leaning in, not waiting for her to fail, waiting to understand. She spoke for 12 minutes. At the end, she clicked to a slide that showed a hand-drawn diagram of the auxiliary hydraulic reroute, the same one from her original notebook. "I didn't draw this to impress anyone," she said. "I drew it because I had to, because something was trying to speak, and the grown-ups in the room were too busy being certain." There was silence, then applause, and not the kind given out of politeness, but the kind that comes when you've just witnessed something that shifts the ground under your feet. That night, Mara Sloan sent Abby a private message. "You didn't just change the conversation, you changed the language." Back in Boston, Abby pinned a new quote to the board above her desk. It wasn't hers. It was from a woman pilot named Nancy Harkness Love, written in 1944. "The most difficult part of being first is not being the best. It's being believed." Underneath it, Abby taped a sticky note in her own handwriting. "They believe me now. But they won't be ready for who comes next." There are rooms where decisions shape the sky, not in hangars or control towers, but behind closed doors where the suits sit, where procedure whispers louder than truth and reputation holds more weight than reason. Abby Carter had never been inside one of those rooms, but now her name was on every agenda. The boardroom at North Atlantic Airways was quiet the morning after the interview aired. 13 executives sat around a polished walnut table, eyes on the flat screen displaying a paused image of a 10-year-old girl with a denim jacket and a watch too big for her wrist. A line of text sat frozen beneath her. "I just heard it first." The room buzzed with tension. At the head of the table, Elaine Dorian, head of legal, folded her hands and spoke first. "We have a problem." No one disagreed. "She was in the cockpit," said another executive. "And we've already submitted a report that makes no mention of her." "We didn't lie," someone else mumbled. "We just curated the truth." Elaine raised an eyebrow. The FAA doesn't care about curated truths. They care about protocol violations. And if the public realizes we intentionally excluded a minor's intervention— Her voice trailed off, but the meaning hung heavy. Captain Doyle's formal statement hadn't just praised Abby. It had directly challenged the airline's official narrative. And now, the FAA was reopening the incident. The room fell into argument, some suggesting public apology, others insisting they'd double down and defend standard procedure. And then someone said what no one else wanted to say aloud. She shouldn't have been in the room. Silence. But she was, Elaine replied. And she saved that plane. Miles away, in a smaller room at Abby's school, the principal sat with her father, holding a copy of Time magazine with Abby on the cover. She's being pulled out of class constantly now, the principal said. The attention, the press, it's becoming disruptive. Her father folded his arms. She didn't ask for this. I understand. But perhaps it's time to consider alternative schooling. Because she solved a problem no adult could? Because the world isn't ready for a 10-year-old in the cockpit. That phrase echoed again later that week, this time in Washington. An FAA closed-session meeting convened to address Flight 1962 and the rising controversy around the girl in seat 14C. Behind glass doors, engineers, safety regulators, and policy lawyers debated how to proceed. One representative from the airline insisted she wasn't qualified. She had no clearance, no formal training. A younger FAA official leaned forward and asked, "Did she save the flight?" Silence. "Yes or no?" the younger man pressed. Another replied reluctantly, "Yes." "Then maybe," he said, "we're the ones who weren't qualified." Meanwhile, in Boston, Abby wasn't thinking about policy. She was sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by notes and sticky papers, staring at a whiteboard titled, "Who Gets to Speak in a Crisis?" Under it were 3 columns: listened to and believed dismissed before they could speak, heard but erased afterward. She had her grandfather's name under the second, her own under the third. She hesitated, and then wrote Captain Doyle, because he had let her speak. And more importantly, he had heard her. 2 days later, Abby received a package. Inside was a leather folder, stitched in gold thread with the North Atlantic Airways emblem. At first, she thought it was another media kit or legal document. But when she opened it, her hands stilled. It was the official internal flight incident report for Flight 1962, revised. Inside, a full paragraph acknowledged, "Mid-flight course correction advised by minor passenger Abby Carter, whose technical recommendation to divert hydraulic pressure prevented potential escalation of failure. Captain Doyle accepted advice after verifying logic under duress." Her name was in the system now, but that wasn't all. Tucked in the back sleeve was a short, handwritten letter. "Abby, I won't pretend we got this right the first time. We didn't. But truth has a way of flying back to you. Even when you try to shut the hangar door, you belong in every room where the safety of others depends on someone who listens. Sincerely, Elaine Dorian, North Atlantic Airways." Legal Abby didn't show the letter to anyone. She didn't need to. Instead, she pinned it beside her grandfather's FAA rejection slip from 2018 and wrote across them both. One was ignored, the other wasn't. That's how flight safety begins to change. Back at North Atlantic, pressure continued to build. Pilots' union reps began asking questions. Simulators were updated with a new training module, one based on the Greaves-Carter model. But behind the scenes, the airline still struggled to accept what had happened. One exec, reviewing the new training doc, muttered again, "She shouldn't have been in the room." Captain Doyle, walking past the doorway, stopped, and for the first time he turned to face the voices behind the curtain. I invited her in, he said. You trusted a child over your own co-pilot? No, Doyle replied. I trusted the only person who understood what the plane was saying. Then he walked away. That night, Abby and her father stood on the rooftop of their apartment building, looking at the stars. Her father handed her a folded paper from MIT's aeronautics lab. What's this? Abby asked. He smiled. It's an invitation. To what? To write your own protocol. They're letting you submit it formally. For peer review. Abby stared at the paper. No cartoon fonts, no patronizing language, just a form, blank lines, and a space for one name. Author. She took the pen slowly and wrote, Abigail W. Carter, with gratitude to Walter Greaves. There was no chalkboard, no classroom, no certificate, just a wall in Abby Carter's bedroom, now completely covered in sticky notes, some yellow, some blue, a few neon green, each one labeled with a handwritten observation, a question, a hypothesis, or a quote from her grandfather. At the very top, a strip of duct tape held a sign, Things Grandpa never got to write into a manual. It wasn't a decoration, it was a classroom, and she was its only student, and its only teacher. After the revised incident report went public, the world didn't just acknowledge Abby, it wanted more of her. Universities reached out. Engineering firms sent books, gear, simulators, even invitations to tour. A startup in Palo Alto offered to name a flight prediction algorithm after her. Someone else suggested a scholarship fund. But what Abby wanted most wasn't any of those things. She wanted a space where she could listen, think, and build what her grandfather never got the chance to finish. And that space became her room. Every day after school, Abby would come home, drop her backpack, and head straight for the wall. Her father stopped asking what she was doing. He just made sure she had enough tape, markers, and printer paper. The sticky notes became a constellation. Stabilizer lag during light crosswind equals not pilot error. Hydraulic groan at 32 degrees Fahrenheit equals temperature threshold shift. Some machines scream, some whisper. Ghost hitch number 19. In new Boeing model. Similar tone, different pitch? Next to each note, she pinned screenshots, sound wave graphs, hand-drawn schematics. It wasn't just a wall, it was a living archive. A flight school without a name. One afternoon, while Abby was tracing out the angle of airflow vectors across a paper napkin, her new preferred medium, the doorbell rang. She barely looked up. "Can you get it?" she called to her dad. Seconds later, she heard a voice she hadn't expected to hear again. "Permission to enter flight school?" Abby spun around. It was Captain Doyle. In his hands, a small black box and an envelope. They sat at the kitchen table, just like they had in the debrief room in Baltimore months ago, only now there were no suits, no forms, no overhead lights humming like threats. Only sunlight. And two people who had saved a plane together. Doyle set the box on the table. "Open it," he said. Inside was a silver pin, a set of miniature wings, the kind given to commercial pilots upon graduation from flight training. Real ones, not the plastic kind handed to kids. Abby stared. "But I'm not—" "You are," he interrupted gently. "You've earned it more honestly than half the people I trained with. Maybe more." He handed her the envelope next. Inside was a card with the North Atlantic logo and 3 simple words. Future Captain's Wings awarded to Abby Carter. Her breath caught. Doyle looked at her seriously. "I can't change what the system did to your grandfather, but I can make sure that at least once The sky gives something back. Abby didn't cry. She only nodded, eyes full and wide, before pinning the wings directly onto the middle of the sticky note wall. Dead center. The next week, the FAA released a surprise bulletin titled, Listening Protocols, Case Study on Pattern Recognition Outside Instrumentation. It cited the Greaves-Carter model as a new class of risk prediction, emphasizing the importance of tactile feedback, resonance anomalies, and non-digital observational logic. It included Abby's name and Walter Greaves. On page 3, a line read, True aviation safety may require the willingness to listen to those outside traditional control. A professor at Embry-Riddle tweeted, She did what most of us spend decades failing at. She saw what the system was trained not to notice. The post went viral. Meanwhile, at Abby's school, things changed. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. One of her classmates, a quiet girl named Lainey, brought Abby a small notebook at lunch and whispered, I draw maps of engine vibrations, not with numbers but with colors. Can I show you sometime? Abby said yes. They sat under the trees after school, talking about patterns and sound. For the first time, Abby wasn't the only strange genius in the room. She wasn't alone anymore. A month later, Abby stood on the stage of the annual Flight Safety Conference in Chicago, the youngest speaker in its 73-year history. She wore her denim jacket, and pinned to the collar, the future captain's wings. The room was filled with engineers, regulators, commercial pilots, researchers, many of whom still weren't sure what to make of her. But when Abby walked to the podium, the only sound was the click of her shoes on the wood floor. She didn't bring slides. She brought one sticky note and held it up. A plane talks, not in alarms, not in beeps, but in behavior, in tone, in breath. We built machines to fly them, but forgot how to feel them. She let the silence sit, then added, You don't need a license to hear what's screaming in the walls. You just need someone who won't tell you to be quiet. Thunderous applause followed. But Abby didn't smile because of that. She smiled because she saw, in the front row, a man with trembling hands, Frank Bellamy, standing and wiping his eyes, and next to him, her father's empty chair, now occupied by a framed photo of Walter Greaves, the man who first listened. That night, Abby returned to Boston and added a final sticky note to the wall. It was simple. Blue ink. All caps. This is where real flight school begins. She stepped back and looked at the wall, not as a child who had done something impossible, but as a girl who had turned silence into structure. Her fingers touched the wings on her collar, and she whispered, not to be heard, but to remember. You were right, Grandpa. They're finally listening. Abby Carter was 11 now, still small, still quiet, still wearing the same denim jacket with the sleeves rolled above her elbows, but something had changed in her. Not the way she looked, the way she stood. Like someone who had found gravity and learned to bend with it, not break. On the morning of her birthday, she didn't ask for cake or presents. She asked to go to the airport, not to fly, to watch. Her father didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and drove her to the edge of Logan International, where the sound of takeoffs was constant and the smell of jet fuel coated the breeze like salt on the sea. They sat on the hood of his car, sipping hot chocolate as the planes climbed into the cold blue. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Abby didn't answer right away. Then, "I wonder how many voices tried to warn someone, and how many were ignored." He didn't push her further, because he knew what she meant. She wasn't just thinking about Flight 1862 or her grandfather. She was thinking about all the moments throughout history when the answer was sitting in the back row. The aisle seat, the janitor's closet, the desk without a nameplate. Later that week, Abby gave a keynote at the Youth Aviation Futures Conference. She walked on stage wearing her captain's pin, jeans, and a clean white t-shirt with bold text printed across the chest. Just a passenger, until the sky called my name. The audience was mostly students, some her age, some older, and a few who had never even set foot on a plane before. She didn't use slides. She didn't read a script. She just began. When I was 10, I got on a plane thinking I was just going to see my dad. I didn't expect the plane to cry for help. I didn't expect the cockpit to open. And I didn't expect that I'd be the one who knew what to do. A pause. But what changed my life wasn't just saving that flight. It was being listened to. By one person, in one impossible moment. And when he listened, everything else made sense. She told them about Walter Greaves, about sticky notes and ghost hitches and listening to things that didn't speak in words. She spoke not as a prodigy, but as a peer. Not as a symbol, but as someone who still doubted herself every day, and had learned that doubt was part of intelligence, not proof against it. Then she looked out across the rows of students, engineers, and instructors, and said the one thing they weren't expecting. I'm not the future of aviation because I'm smart. I'm the future because someone believed I was worth listening to. Silence. The kind that lands on a room when truth has just arrived. Then from the front row, a small voice asked, "Do you think I could do what you did?" It was a girl, maybe 8, sitting beside a woman in a pilot's uniform. Her mother. Abby smiled. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out a folded cloth, and stepped off the stage. She knelt in front of the girl, unfolded the cloth, and revealed a second pair of future aviator wings. She pinned them to the girl's shirt and whispered, "You already are." That image, Abby Carter, 11 years old, kneeling to pass her wings forward, went viral in less than 48 hours. But what no one posted was what she did next. She left the stage, found a quiet corner of the conference center, pulled out a napkin, and began to sketch. A new failure mode. A vibration pattern she hadn't seen before. Something she'd noticed in the hum of an aging aircraft during a layover. She wrote, "Possibly linked to engine cooling asymmetry? Investigate." It wasn't flashy. It wasn't a speech. It was the real work. The part that mattered. In the months that followed, Abby began working with an independent think tank focused on adaptive diagnostics in commercial aviation. She wasn't on payroll. She wasn't a mascot. She was part of the technical team. Her role, analyzing non-conventional indicators, strange sounds, overlooked patterns, resonance anomalies. The things machines didn't catch, but humans could, if they stopped trying to outsmart the silence and simply listened. She called it the listening layer, and she was building it into something real. One evening, her father peeked into her room. "Still working?" Abby was hunched over her desk, headphones on, audio waveforms scrolling across her screen. "Yeah," she said, pulling the headphones down. "I thought maybe you'd take a break tonight." She smiled, tired but warm. "I will." He walked in and sat beside her. On the wall, the sticky notes had grown again. Not just hers now, others too. Notes from kids at the conference, engineers who'd mailed her ideas. One from Captain Doyle scribbled on a napkin. "Sometimes leadership is just listening before the crash comes." Her father looked around the room. "You've built something here." "I'm not done," she said. "I don't think you ever will be," he replied. And he didn't mean that as a warning. He meant it as a promise. That summer, She visited her grandfather's grave for the first time in nearly a year. She brought the watch. The real one. The one that had started ticking again in the cockpit. She set it on the stone gently, then sat cross-legged beside it. "Guess what, Grandpa?" she whispered. "They used your name in the manual." She smiled. "They finally heard you." She stayed for a long time, just sitting, listening, to the wind, to the sky, to the place where it had all begun, in the hallway of the new Greaves-Carter Listening Lab. A quote is etched into the wall beside the entrance. "The cockpit isn't where authority lives, it's where attention decides what lives and what falls." Abby Carter, age 11. And just below it, in smaller letters, a second line. "Listening is a kind of flying." Walter Greaves. The lab accepts students from anywhere. No age requirement, no credentials. Just a question. What have you heard that others haven't yet believed? The sky doesn't belong